The conquest was a thing of iron and fire, but the rule that followed was meant to be one of stone and order. King Draven had built his reign on this principle, that what was won by the sword must be held by the law, and the first law was the king's tongue. It was the language of treaties and decrees, of commerce and command. To speak it was to belong to the new world he was carving from the heart of the old. To refuse it was to remain a ghost in one's own land. His bride, Nia, was not a ghost. She was the most solid, tangible piece of his victory, a daughter of the defeated chieftain, given to seal a peace that tasted of ash in her people's mouths. He had chosen her for the defiance in her eyes, a flicker of the same fire he'd sought to quell across the entire valley of Arinia. He thought, in his arrogance, that he could tame that fire, make it a hearth flame that would warm his halls and legitimize his throne. He saw her beauty as a sigil of his triumph, her silence as a vessel waiting to be filled with his words, his culture, his reign. On their wedding night, in the cavernous chill of his northern fortress, she had spoken to him for the first time in the soft, lilting cadence of her mother tongue. The words were a question, he presumed, or a plea. He did not know. He only knew the sound of it was a relic of the world he had dismantled. "You will speak the common tongue," he had commanded, his voice flat, leaving no room for negotiation. "My tongue, the tongue of this court, of this kingdom." She had looked at him then, her dark eyes wide, and he saw not defiance, but a sudden, hollowing loss. The fire did not die. It retreated, banked deep behind a wall of careful compliance. She nodded, a single sharp gesture of acquiescence, and she had never spoken her own language in his presence again. In the years that followed, she became a paragon of the conqueror's queen. Her accent in his language, once thick with the music of her homeland, smoothed into a flawless, courtly precision. She learned his histories, his customs, his intricate politics. She moved through the cold stone halls of his castle like a dancer who had memorized a difficult and joyless choreography. She was gracious, she was elegant, she was admired. To Draven, she was a masterpiece of his own making, a testament to his transformative power. He was proud of her. He told himself, in the quiet hours before dawn, when the weight of his crown was a physical ache in his skull, that he loved her. But his love was a cage gilded with admiration. He loved the queen she had become, not the woman she had been forced to bury. He never asked about the songs her mother sang to her, or the names her people had for the stars he could see from his balcony. He never wondered what her laughter sounded like when it was not a polite, measured thing for the benefit of his courtiers. Her past, her language, her very soul, these were territories he had conquered but never bothered to explore. He owned the land, but he had never learned its contours. The silence between them grew into a vast, uncharted wilderness. They spoke of statecraft, of harvests, of the endless machinations of the court. Their conversations were a series of carefully constructed bridges over a chasm of unspoken things. Sometimes he would catch her staring at a window, her eyes fixed on the distant, mist-shrouded peaks that marked the edge of her former homeland, and a flicker of something unreadable would cross her face. He would feel a brief, sharp pang of unease, a sense that he was standing on the shore of an ocean, admiring the surface while utterly ignorant of the crushing depths below. But the feeling always passed, dismissed as a flight of fancy. She was his queen. She was content. He had given her a world. It had not occurred to him to ask what world he had taken away. The rebellion, when it came, was not a surprise. Resentment, left to fester in the dark, will always rot the foundations of power. It began with whispers in the countryside, then escalated to sabotage and skirmishes. Draven met it with the same brutal efficiency with which he had won the kingdom. But this was a different kind of war, fought in shadows and alleyways, and the target was not his army, but him. He was the symbol of their subjugation, the Iron King in his stone fortress, and they wanted his head. The attack came on the day of the sun's zenith festival, a celebration Draven had instituted to supplant an older Irinian solstice rite. He stood on a high balcony overlooking the main square of the capital, Nia at his side. She was dressed in fabrics the color of a winter sky, a stark and beautiful contrast to the riot of color in the crowd below. He felt a surge of possessive pride. She was the jewel of his kingdom, proof that the old and the new could be joined in perfect, beautiful harmony. He leaned toward her, his voice a low murmur against the roar of the crowd. "You are beautiful today, my queen." She turned her head, and for a fleeting second, the practiced mask of serene grace slipped. He saw a flicker of the girl with fire in her eyes, a raw, startling vulnerability that made his breath catch. "And you are a king, Draven," she said, her voice soft, but with an edge he hadn't heard in years. "You see what you wish to see." Before he could process the strange, unsettling weight of her words, it happened. A movement in the crowd below, too swift, too sharp, the glint of steel in the midday sun. Draven's instincts, honed by a lifetime of war, screamed. He saw the assassin on a nearby rooftop, the crossbow leveled not at the crowd, but at him. Time seemed to stretch, to thin into a crystalline stillness. He moved to shove Nia behind him, to shield her with his own body, his own life a fair price for the order he had built. But she was faster. He never knew if she saw the assassin, or if she simply felt the sudden shift in his posture, the tensing of his muscles. In that fractional, eternal moment, she did not move away from the danger. She moved toward it. She stepped in front of him, a deliberate, fluid motion, her body a shield for his. It was not an act of instinct, it was an act of will. The crossbow bolt struck her high in the chest with a sickening thud. The sound was swallowed by the festival's noise, but for Draven, it was a thunderclap that shattered the world. The color and chaos of the square dissolved into a blur. The only thing in focus was Nia. A small, dark flower of red bloomed on the pale fabric of her gown. Her eyes, wide with shock, found his. A gasp escaped her lips, a soft, broken sound. And then she crumpled. He caught her before she hit the stone floor, his arms wrapping around her as his guards swarmed forward, their shouts a distant, meaningless roar. He lowered her gently to the ground, his mind a maelstrom of denial and horror. "Mia," he breathed, his hand pressing against the wound, as if he could physically push her life back into her body. The warmth of her blood soaked his fingers, his fine tunic, a visceral refutation of his desperate hope. Her breath came in ragged, shallow pants. The careful mask of the queen was gone, stripped away by the brutal intimacy of death. In its place was the face of a terrified woman, a girl from a conquered land, dying in the arms of her conqueror. Her eyes, glazed with pain, searched his. Her lips parted, and she began to speak. But the words that came out were not his. They were the soft, liquid sounds of her mother tongue, the forbidden language, the ghost he had tried to exorcise from his kingdom and from her. It poured from her in a desperate, tearful torrent, a river of sound that he could not navigate. He saw the urgency in her eyes, the frantic need to make him understand. She was trying to tell him something vital, her last and most important message, and the words were meaningless noise to him. "Nia, no," he pleaded, his voice cracking. "Speak the common tongue, please. I don't understand." Her expression crumpled into a heart-wrenching sob of frustration and fear. Her hand, slick with her own blood, gripped his tunic. She tried again, her voice weaker now, the words punctuated by hitching, painful breaths. It was a lament, a story, a final confession he would never know. He could only watch, helpless, as the soul he had never known slipped away from him in a language he had refused to learn. Panic, cold and absolute, seized him. This was a failure more profound than any lost battle, a defeat more complete than the crumbling of his entire kingdom. He had demanded her voice, and now, when he needed it most, he could not comprehend it. The years of his arrogance, his willful ignorance, crashed down upon him in a single, devastating wave. He had possessed her, but he had never known her. And she would die a stranger in his arms. The light was fading from her eyes. The stream of words faltered, dissolving into a faint, guttural whisper. Her grip on his tunic loosened. "No," he snarled, a feral sound torn from the depths of his being. He would not lose her. He would not let his last memory of her be this monument to his own foolish pride. The royal physicians were scrambling onto the balcony, their faces pale with terror. Draven knew, with a chilling certainty, that they were useless. The bolt was too deep, the damage too catastrophic. Mortal medicine was a child's game against a wound like this. But he was not entirely mortal. It was a secret of his bloodline, a dark and terrible inheritance passed down from the founding king of his dynasty, a pact made in shadow and paid for with an eternal thirst. It was a power he had never used, a curse he had intended to take to his grave. But his grave seemed a paltry thing compared to the abyss opening at his feet. To save her, he would have to destroy her. He would have to damn her to an eternity of twilight to keep her from slipping into the final dark. It was a monstrously selfish act, a violation far greater than stealing her language. He would be saving her not for her own sake, but to give himself a chance to atone, to spare himself the agony of this final, unbreachable silence. He looked down at her face, now ashen and still. Her breathing had almost stopped. There was no time. "Forgive me," he whispered, the words a prayer to a woman who could no longer hear him. He bent his head, his lips brushing against the pale, cooling skin of her neck. He hesitated for a heartbeat, the ancient, predatory instinct rising within him, a thing of hunger and power. Then he closed his eyes, and he bit down. The taste of her was life and death, salt and sorrow. He drew her fading life into himself, the coppery warmth a tragic echo of the vibrant woman she had been. He held himself back from the brink, from the all-consuming hunger that threatened to devour him. Then he bit his own wrist, the skin parting easily, and pressed the wound to her lips. "Drink," he commanded, his voice a raw rasp. "Nia, drink." His blood, ancient and potent, welled up and trickled into her mouth. For a moment there was nothing. Then a faint, convulsive swallow. Her still form shuddered, a violent, unnatural tremor that racked her from head to foot. He held her tight, anchoring her to the world as the venom of his immortality began its work, rewriting her flesh, extinguishing the last embers of her mortal life to kindle a new, colder fire. The transformation was a terrible, silent crucible. He had her carried to their chambers, dismissing everyone, even the most trusted guards. He barred the doors and stood vigil over the woman who was both his wife and his victim. For 2 weeks, the world outside ceased to exist. Rebellions and kingdoms were dust and shadows compared to the profound, alchemical horror unfolding in the quiet of this room. Nia lay upon their bed, unnervingly still, like a sculpture carved from alabaster. The wound in her chest had closed, leaving behind no scar, only unnaturally flawless skin. Her body, once warm, grew cool to the touch, her skin taking on the pale luminescence of a winter moon. The slow, rhythmic rise and fall of her breathing had ceased entirely. She was a perfect, beautiful corpse. But Draven knew it was a chrysalis. Inside that silent form, a monster was being made. And as he watched, the guilt consumed him. It was a physical entity, a leaden weight in his gut, a constant, bitter taste in his mouth. The memory of her last, incomprehensible words played over and over in his mind, a ghostly litany of his failure. He had stood at the doorway to her soul as she was leaving, and he hadn't even known how to ask her to stay. He would not fail her again. On the second day of his vigil, he sent for a man named Elian. He was an old, stooped scholar, one of the few Irinian elders who had been spared during the purges of the old culture, kept alive for his knowledge of botany and history. He had been relegated to the castle's dusty library, a living relic Draven had all but forgotten. When Elian entered the royal chambers, his eyes, clouded with age, widened in fear at the sight of the king's blood-stained clothes and the deathly stillness of the queen on the bed. "Your Majesty," he began, his voice trembling. "You will teach me," Draven said, his voice raw with sleeplessness and grief. He did not rise. He did not look away from Naya's face. "You will teach me her language. Now." The old man stared, bewildered. "My lord?" "Every word, every inflection, every turn of phrase," Draven commanded, his gaze finally snapping to Elian, and the force of it made the old man flinch. "You will not leave this room. You will not sleep until I can speak it as if I were born to it. Begin." And so began Draven's penance. While Naya's body waged its silent war, he waged his own. The language of Arinia was nothing like his own guttural, consonant-heavy tongue. It was a language of flowing vowels and soft consonants, of intricate grammar that seemed to mirror the winding rivers and dense forests of the land itself. It felt alien in his mouth. His first attempts were clumsy, brutal things, a conqueror's tongue trying to shape itself around the delicate sounds of the conquered. Elian, sensing the terrifying urgency in the king, taught with a desperate fervor. He started with the basics, words for water, for stone, for sky, for pain. Aethel, lithos, kalis, dolor. Draven repeated them until his throat was raw, the sounds scraping against his palate. He paced the room like a caged wolf, his shadow falling over Naya's still form, his voice a constant, guttural murmur. He learned the words for love and for sorrow. Amara, luctus. They felt like sacrilege on his tongue. He learned the word for forgiveness, venia, and he choked on it. Days bled into nights. He did not eat. He did not sleep. He only watched Naya for the smallest sign of change and forced the strange, beautiful words into his mind, into his mouth, into his very being. The language was a fortress, and he laid siege to it with the full force of his iron will. He was not just learning vocabulary, he was trying to absorb a world view. He learned that the Irinian language had 7 different words for rain, depending on its intensity and duration, and a single complex verb to describe the way moonlight falls through the leaves of a forest. He was discovering, word by agonizing word, the world he had forced Nia to abandon. Each new phrase was a fresh stab of guilt. He was learning the shape of the soul he had tried to erase. As the second week drew to a close, 2 transformations were nearing their completion. In Draven, the language began to settle. The clumsy sounds smoothed into a passable accent. He could form complex sentences, understand the subtle poetry woven into the fabric of the grammar. He could feel the ghost of Nia's voice in the words, the music he had once dismissed as peasant chatter. And on the bed, Nia began to stir. It began with a flicker of her eyelids, then a faint tremor in her fingers. The unnatural stillness was giving way to a new kind of tension, her muscles coiling beneath her skin like a predator about to wake. The thirst, he knew, would be the first thing she felt. A burning, all-consuming agony that would eclipse memory, identity, everything. He dismissed a terrified Elian with a bag of gold and a threat of silence, then stood alone by her bed, his heart, which had felt like a stone for 2 weeks, now hammering against his ribs. The moment came just after midnight. Her eyes snapped open. But they were not the warm, dark eyes he remembered. They were the eyes of a nocturnal hunter, the pupils dilated to drink in the scant moonlight filtering through the window, a faint, predatory luminescence glowing in their depths. She sat up, not with the groggy slowness of a mortal waking, but with a single, swift, silent motion. Her head tilted, her senses now impossibly sharp, taking in the world for the first time. She could likely hear the frantic heartbeat of a mouse in the castle walls, smell the dust on the tapestries, feel the subtle vibrations of the guards walking their patrol 2 floors below. Her gaze fell on him. There was no recognition in it, only a stark, primal assessment. He was warm. He was breathing. He was food. A low growl rumbled in her chest, a sound that was not human. Her lips, once soft, peeled back from her teeth, revealing elongated canines. The thirst was a fire in her, and he was the only fuel in the room. He stood his ground, his own ancient instincts screaming at him to either dominate or flee. He did neither. He simply stood there, vulnerable, meeting the gaze of the beautiful monster he had created. He had to reach the woman buried beneath the hunger. He had to speak to Nia, not the fledgling vampire. He took a slow, deliberate breath. He opened his mouth, and with all the care and contrition of his 14-day penance, he spoke. Not in his language. In hers. "Ethelon," he said, his voice soft, the strange, beautiful words feeling both foreign and profoundly right on his tongue. "My star. Nia, can you hear me?" The effect was instantaneous and absolute. The growl died in her throat. The predatory focus in her eyes wavered, replaced by a flicker of profound, bewildered shock. Her head cocked to the side, as if she were hearing an impossible sound. The fangs retracted slightly. She stared at him, not as prey, but as a puzzle, a paradox that her new, sharp mind could not immediately solve. The sound of her own language, the language of her childhood, of her heart, coming from the mouth of her conqueror, her husband, the man who had forbidden it, it was a key turning in a lock that had been rusted shut for years. It bypassed the hunger, the rage, the confusion of her new nature, and struck something deeper, something essential. You speak," she whispered, and the words that came from her mouth were Iranian. Her voice was different, a low, resonant alto, but the cadence was the one he now knew intimately, the one he had heard in his head for 2 weeks. "I learned," he replied, taking a hesitant step closer. He kept his hands open, his posture unthreatening. "I had to, while you slept." He did not say, "while you were dead," or "while you were changing." The truth was too brutal, and he had been brutal enough. She looked down at her hands, at the pale, flawless skin. She touched her own neck, her chest, where the wound should have been. Confusion warred with dawning horror on her face. What happened? I remember the festival, the pain." Her eyes shot back to his, sharp and accusing. "What did you do to me?" The hunger was still there, a burning coal beneath the surface of her shock, but her mind was now fighting for control. He had to anchor her, to give her a reason to fight it. He knelt before her, an act of supplication he had never offered another living soul. He was a king, but in this room, he was only a penitent. He met her gaze, his own eyes filled with a grief and regret so profound it was a physical weight. "You were dying," he said, his voice thick with emotion, every word in her native tongue a piece of his confession. "They could not save you. I could not let you go, not like that. Not like what? She pressed, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and nascent power. The shame was so immense he could barely speak the words. You were speaking to me, at the end. You were trying to tell me something, and I was a fool, an arrogant fool. I could not understand. My entire world was dying in my arms, and I was deaf to its last words because I had ordered it to be silent. Tears, thick and hot, welled in his eyes. He did not bother to wipe them away. He wanted her to see them. He wanted her to see the wreckage of the king she thought she knew. This, he said, gesturing to her, to himself, to the terrible new reality of their existence, was the only way I knew to keep you. It was a selfish act. I damned you to give myself a second chance. A chance to listen. Nia stared at him, her expression unreadable. The beautiful, terrible creature on the bed. His wife, his queen, his creation. The chasm between them had always been there, a silent abyss of language and culture. But now it was deeper, wider, filled with the blood and shadow of what he had done. And yet, for the very first time, he had built a bridge. A fragile, desperate bridge made of her own words. The thirst was still a fire in her throat, an agony demanding release. He could see the struggle in the taut line of her jaw, the clenching of her fists. She was balanced on a knife's edge between the woman she had been and the predator she now was. He held out his arm, baring his wrist, the skin pale over the blue veins. An offering, a continuation of his penance. I know you are in pain, he said softly. I know you hunger. Take what you need. It is the very least I owe you. Her eyes locked on his wrist, and the predatory glow returned, sharper this time. The hunger was a physical thing, a force of nature. He saw her sway, saw the fangs descend once more. This was the moment of truth. Would the monster devour him, or would the woman accept his offering? She moved, a blur of speed he could barely follow, and was before him, her cold hands gripping his arm. Her face was inches from his, and he could feel the chill radiating from her skin. He did not flinch. He held her gaze, waiting for the bite, for the pain that would be a pale shadow of the guilt he carried. She leaned in, her lips parting. He closed his eyes, but the bite never came. Instead, he felt the ghost of her breath on his skin, followed by a single, cold tear that fell onto his wrist. She shuddered, a full-body tremor, and when he opened his eyes, she was looking at him, and the monster was gone. In its place was Nia, her eyes filled with a grief as vast and deep as his own. You learned, she whispered again, her voice breaking. It was not a question this time, but a statement of profound, world-altering fact. I am listening now, he replied, his voice cracking. Nia, I am finally listening. She pulled back, releasing his arm. The immediate danger had passed, but the new reality of their lives had just begun. They were two immortals in a silent room, bound together by violence and regret. The crown, the kingdom, the rebellion, it all seemed impossibly distant. The only world that mattered was the one between them, a world that had to be rebuilt from the ashes, one word at a time. For a long while, they simply looked at each other, the silence between them no longer a chasm of ignorance, but a space of shared, sorrowful understanding. The moonlight cast long shadows across the floor, making the room feel like a tomb and a sanctuary all at once. Finally, he found the courage to ask the question that had haunted him for 2 weeks, the question that had driven him to dismantle his own pride and learn the language of his captive bride. What were you trying to tell me? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. On the balcony, your last words. What were they? Nia's gaze drifted toward the window, toward the sliver of moon in the ink-black sky. A profound sadness settled over her features, aging her immortal face with a mortal weight of memory. "It was not a state secret," she said, her voice distant, lost in the past. "Not a curse on your name. I was not telling you how to defeat the rebels." She turned back to him, her eyes clear and deep, wells of memory he was finally permitted to see into. "I was a child again," she said softly. "I felt the stone of the balcony under my back, and for a moment it was the warm earth of the riverbank where my mother used to take me. The sun was on my face, and I saw her." She paused, swallowing, though she had no saliva. It was the memory of a human gesture. "I was telling you what she always told me when I was scared." She would hold my face in her hands and tell me a story about the river spirit, how it was strong enough to wash away any pain, any fear, how it would carry it down to the great sea and return, clean and new, in the spring rain. Her voice dropped to a whisper, laden with the weight of that final, desperate moment. "I was telling you to let the river take me. I was telling you to let me go home." The words struck Draven with the force of a physical blow. He had thought her final message was for him, a warning, a confession, a plea for his life. He had centered himself even in her dying moments. But she had been seeking comfort, retreating into the one safe place she had left, a memory of her mother, a story in her own tongue. She had not been fighting for his kingdom, she had been asking for release. And in his selfish, desperate love, he had denied her that. He had chained her to this world, to him, to an eternity of night and thirst, all to soothe his own guilty conscience. The full, monstrous weight of his actions settled upon him. He had not saved her, he had stolen her death. He bowed his head, the shame so complete it bent his spine. The king was gone. There was only a man, stripped bare, facing the woman he had wronged in every conceivable way. "Forgive me," he breathed, the words tasting like ash. "Nia, can you ever forgive me?" She was silent for a long time. The hunger still gnawed at her, a dull, constant ache. The world was a symphony of overwhelming sensations. Her own grief was a sharp, cold thing in her chest, where a heart used to be. She looked at this man, this king, this architect of her ruin, and her strange, dark salvation. She saw the genuine anguish on his face, the profound self-loathing in his posture. He had been a tyrant, a fool, a conqueror. But in learning her language, in kneeling before her, in offering his life to sustain hers, he had finally, after all these years, made an effort to see her. It was not forgiveness. It was too soon for that. Forgiveness was a country she might never reach. But it was something, a starting point, a single solid stone in the middle of a raging river. "I do not know," she said, her voice quiet but firm, each Iranian word precise and clear. "Forgiveness is a mortal luxury, and we are no longer mortal." "But you said you were listening." He looked up, his eyes latching onto hers, filled with a desperate, fragile hope. "Then listen now," Nia continued, her gaze unwavering. "This life you have given me, it will be on my terms. This kingdom you rule, it is my land, my home. You will learn its ways not just from a book, but from me. You will learn the names of the stars as my people named them. You will learn the songs my mother sang. You will learn the shape of the soul you tried to erase, and we will rule this land together, not as conqueror and conquered, but as equals." It was not a plea. It was a decree. The fire he had first seen in her eyes all those years ago had not been extinguished. It had been banked, hidden. Now, forged in death and rebirth, it blazed forth, hotter and brighter than ever. She was no longer his masterpiece. She was her own. Draven looked at the woman before him, his queen, his wife, his equal. She was terrifying and magnificent. He had taken everything from her, and in return, she was demanding everything from him. Not his gold, not his armies, but his understanding, his respect, his soul. It was a far greater price than he had ever paid for his crown. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his ancient bones, that he would spend an eternity paying it. Gladly. Yes, he said, and the word, in her language, was a vow. Yes, my queen. Outside, the sun would soon rise, forcing them into the shadows. A new day was coming for the world of men. But for them, in the twilight of their new existence, the long, difficult night had only just begun. And for the first time, they would face it together, speaking the same language.